World War II in the Air Force from February 27th, 1943 to October 24th, 1945. Alright. Were you drafted or did you enlist?
Well, I'll tell you, I tried to enlist because I wanted to be a pilot, and found out I was colorblind and I couldn't make it. But they gave me the bit about go home and eat carrot juice. It didn't work. I tried 3 times and it didn't work. So then I waited, and then a few months later I was drafted. And I lucked out. When I was drafted, I lucked out in my choice. They give you 4 or 5 choices. You want the Navy, you want the Army, and I picked the Air Force. And I lucked out and made that.
Where were you living at the time that you were drafted?
I was living in Grosse Pointe Park.
Was there a reason that you wanted to join?
Well, in those days it was a glory war, and all of us were trying to get in. I'm talking about after December 7th.
Was there a reason that you picked the Air Force? Or that you
Yeah,
wanted to be a pilot?
ever since I was in grade school, I wanted to fly. And I never had enough money for flying lessons, and this was going to be an easy way to get my pilot's license, really.
Do you recall your first days in the service?
Dan Anadjusky, please come to the main office. Dan Anadjusky.
Yes, I do. Yeah, we left from Detroit at the big train station in Detroit, went up to Fort Custer, and I got up there, and like all of us that went up there, we were green teenagers, and they ordered you around, gave you a uniform, and said, "This is it." We stayed at Custer for no more than 3 or 4 days, getting shots, and then we went from Fort Custer down to Florida for basic training to outside of St. Petersburg was a golf course, and the Army or the Air Corps or somebody had leased this golf course from a gentleman whose name was Jimmy Fox, an old baseball player. He owned the golf course. There they set up 500 tents or 1,000 tents, and we called it Tent City. We had no hot water, no restrooms at all. We had latrines out in the combine there, but and everything was cold water. You took a shower in the morning with ice cold water. You went out to the latrine and it was all cold water there. So we were there probably maybe 6 weeks, learning how to follow each other, marching, and what it meant to shut up and do this and do that. And we had all come from pretty much privileged backgrounds in that we didn't have any regimentation at all, so everything was new. And we got up every morning at 5 o'clock, went marched through the city of St. Petersburg to a field where we did our exercises and drills. And they had no electricity in Tent City, and I happened to have a friend that came with me from Detroit, a Jewish man, Jewish boy at that time. He had an uncle in St. Pete, and about the second night we were there, he told me, he says, "Can you get $20?" I said, I had maybe $3 with me, but I went and borrowed some more. I said, "What for?" He said, "Come on, I'll show you." So we went into town. We bought up every candle in St. Petersburg for a quarter or 50 cents. And then we took them back to Tent City that afternoon and went up and down the aisles selling them for $2. And we got cussed out many, many times, but they took them because that was the only reading material, I mean the only light they had for reading. Then to make a long story short, the camp was closed. Well, a couple of the men had written home to their mothers, and then the mothers had written to congressmen and said it's not a very hospitable place, there's no running water, there's no this, no, and so it was closed after 8 weeks. We were there the week after it opened. We were there for 6 weeks, and then it was closed.
Do you remember any of your instructors?
Yeah, many of them called them many, many nasty names, but I don't remember them by name.
Where did you go after that?
While we were down there, we went into a tent and were given a selection of where we wanted to go. And at that time, I was in the Air Force, and I decided I'd like to go to radio school. And so we went into this tent, and they said, you have an option. You can go to Chicago, to the hotel in Chicago that was taken over by the Air Force for radio school. But unfortunately, that's filled, so you can go to Belleville, Illinois, which is just outside of East St. Louis, to a radio school. And we were there, or I was there, probably 7 weeks, learning how to take radios apart and learning how to run a key in for sending messages and so forth.
What was your job assignment? Or
Radio operator on a bomber.
Did you ever see combat?
Yes, I went after radio school. Then I went to Las Vegas to a gunnery school where we started with a .22 rifle, and then we went up to a 30 caliber machine gun, then a 50 caliber machine gun, and learned how to take them all apart, put them back together. And you had to learn how to do that at the end blindfolded, because when you were in combat, if you were ever shot up and couldn't see and your machine guns jammed, you had to take them apart blindfolded, but you wouldn't be able to see, put them back together. Then from there, we were still individuals. All of us were individual radio operators. From there, we went to March Field, where we joined a crew. Now, you have to remember that in some place in the United States there was mechanics training, somewhere else there were some pilots, navigators, all training. So then we all gathered together at March Field and were assigned to a crew. And we flew, and March Field is in California. And we flew out of March Field for several months on training as a crew, out over the Pacific and up to San Francisco, and doing what they called a triangle fly. You fly out here, fly out there, make a big triangle and come back. And myself, well, the pilot and the navigator had to know what they were doing, but the radio operator had to train on calling the radio station back at March Field and tell them we're getting ready to come in and stuff like that. So we learned the fundamentals. Oh, and I might add, we were trained at March Field and given summer uniforms, and we were going to go to the Pacific as a crew. But, and this will sound crude, but our navigator, in the meantime, got himself a girlfriend, went out in the field and shacked up with her and got poison ivy. And so they took us all, the whole crew took us down and stood us down, what they call stand down. And he was in the hospital for a couple weeks anyway. Then when he got out of the hospital, he came back and they said, no, by the way, they don't need you in the Philippines, you're going to go to Europe. And so they shipped us in a train as a crew with a nice private room and everything else from California back to New Jersey. And there we were in New Jersey in a few days, and then we got issued heavier clothes and shipped over to England on a destroyer that was converted to a people carrier. There were about 3,000 of us on this boat. And we ended up going to England first, not England, to Ireland first. Thank you. And we went to Ireland first, and while we were in Ireland, we learned English money, we learned English communications, because they all have their own special deal. And we trained there, and then we flew in large transports from Ireland over to the base that I was stationed at in England, which was a place called Norwich, called Horsham St. Faith, 90 miles north of Norwich on the, I guess it would be the east coast on the Channel side. And in that area there were probably 5 or 6 large airfields that had been taken over by the Americans for us, for bomber crews. While we were flying over there, we still didn't know where we were going to end up. Going from Ireland to England, I looked down and I saw about 1,000 gliders. And this is before D-Day. And I couldn't figure out what was going on at that time, but when we got to our base, we found out what was going on. They were getting ready for D-Day. And so we trained maybe a day or two there in June, early June. And then they said, you're too green, we won't let you fly ground support for the troops on D-Day. But the day after D-Day, you'll fly. So we flew the first, and these missions were not counted, we flew the first week after D-Day in support of the ground troops. And that is all, was all low-level flying, 1,000 feet at the most, or 500 feet, whatever. The troops were going this way, we would fly ahead of them and drop anti-personnel bombs on the Germans. And then that only lasted for about 3 or 4 days, and then they sent us back to our base, and from there on it was all bombing from 26,000 feet. Flew over France, Belgium, Germany, and any place else we had to go.
Were there any casualties among men that you knew?
Yeah, very much so. Not on our particular crew. We were, knock on wood, we were lucky. But my best friend was, we were on a mission and they were flying in the next squadron to our right. And they were hit by anti-aircraft fire. And I saw their plane going down and no parachutes coming out. There were 10 of us on each plane and there were no parachutes came out. So he went down.
Were you awarded any medals or?
Yes, the Air Medal with 3 oak leaf clusters and the Distinguished Flying Cross. And I brought them along just for. This is the Air Medal.
Wow.
And that's the DFC. And these are the little wings that we wore.
What did you get these for?
Just being alive and being over there.
Just bring the camera over. Okay. Just a second here. You say what they were again, please?
That's the Distinguished Flying Cross. That's for 35 missions. This is the Air Medal, and you got that starting at 20. We got that at 20, and then every 5 missions after that, you would get what they call a cluster. And I don't have the cluster with me. These are what we had on our uniforms. And this is what the crew looked like when we were doing high-level bombing, 26,000. Now this is a dress-up jacket that they gave us for low-level missions and for when we went in town. It's called an A2 jacket. And we were issued this, and we wore it all the time when we went in to attract the girls. Now, unless they lost it, I had a pair of sunglasses in here someplace. We were issued, oh, here they are, right here. Oh, and by the way, this patch was not on the jacket. When we wore this jacket on low-level bombing, you could not have any identification of where you were from. what base you were from or anything else. My wife got this for me and sewed it on after, well, way after the war. She didn't sew it on, we had it sewed on. But that was the group I flew with, 8th Air Force, 458 Bomb Group, 754th Squadron. And we used that only on the first week of flying on that low-level stuff. When we went up to high-level bombing, we had these suits, and under that suit were we had an electric suit.
What did those do?
Well, because we were flying so high, the outside temperature was minus 57 degrees, and in the plane it was about the same. And so you got these electric suits. Electric shoes would plug into the electric pants. The pants would plug into the jacket. The jacket would plug into the sleeves. They were all, it was nylon. And they were all nylon. And then these are all fur-lined. And we had those in case the electricity went out on the plane. If you got shot up badly enough, the electricity would go out. And when we got to 10,000 feet, we had to go on oxygen. We stayed on oxygen all the while we were flying until we came back and came down.
How did you stay in touch with your family while you were over?
They had, I can't remember what they called it, but they had a little special mail job, a mail package that all of the GIs in the Air Force, in the infantry, and any place could send back. It was called something like email in those days. It was a special job that we didn't have to put any stamps on or anything else.
What was the food like?
Well, and this I always felt guilty about because the infantry had to live out of their packs and everything else, but because we were Air Force and because we were bombing, we had the best food in the world. It was we lived by ourselves in a barracks that had belonged to the RAF, the Royal Air Force. We took over their field, and we lived in the officers' barracks. And every time we'd go on a mission, well, anytime, we would have the best of everything: fresh eggs, bacon, potatoes. And after I got out of service, I thought, yeah, they gave it to me because it was your last, could have been your last meal, you know. And I'm sure that wasn't the reason, but.
Did you always have plenty of supplies?
Yeah. When we flew on the bombing missions, we were issued a 45 automatic in case we ever were shot down. And I don't know whether I would have killed a German or not, but we were issued that 45 with ammunition, of course.
Did you feel pressure or stress?
That's a good question, because the only time I didn't feel any pressure or stress was the very first time, because I didn't know what was going on. But after the first mission, when the flak came up, this is anti-aircraft, flak would come up and you'd see a black burst here, black burst there. And I didn't think an awful lot of it until, you know, they hit the wing and started rattling it, and I saw a plane go down. Then I realized what it was. Yeah, everyone after that, I was sweating all the time. All of us were, not just me. And when we first went over, the war was going rather slowly on the ground, and we were going to fly 25 bombing missions. Then a month or two into the war on the ground, it wasn't going as well as the higher-ups thought, so they said, well, instead of 25, you have to go 30. So we flew 30, and then it still wasn't going too well. Then it was 35, and all of the times in between, America was losing too many airplanes, too many people, because on each bomber, B-17s and B-24s, I was on a 24, there were 10 men, and each time a plane would go down, you'd lose, not always, but they'd either be interned or they'd die in a prison camp.
Did you know anyone that was ever a prisoner of war?
Our bombardier, well, back the story up. As you got a few missions under your belt, and myself included, they would pick you off and put you with a green crew. And you would have to tell this green crew, this is the way you do this, this is the way you do that. And they took our bombardier and put him on a green crew. On about second or third mission, he was shot down. And so we did not see him until 6 months later. He came back from German prison camp. No, that's wrong. He was never captured. The underground got a hold of him, and the underground was civilian people that helped us. The underground got him and shipped him all over Belgium, France, Germany, and got him out. And then we saw him about 3 or 4 months later. He came back through the station that we were at, but he couldn't tell us anything about where he'd been or who helped him or anything else. They shipped him back and quickly got him out of our place and shipped him back to the United States, where he was interrogated. And after every mission we were interrogated. Also, we had cameras on each one of the machine guns, and we would film. These are the guns that were shooting at the German planes. We would film everything so that if you said, oh, I shot down 2 planes, you had to have the film to back it up.
Was there anything special that you did for good luck?
Yeah, it really wasn't, well, it was very special to me. We would go to Mass. Those of us that were Catholics would go to Mass every morning. And this is like 5 o'clock in the morning, the chaplain would get up and have Mass. Hopefully that brought us back alive.
How did people entertain themselves?
When we weren't flying, we would play cards, any kind of cards, and then we also had entertainers that came over. In fact, Glenn Miller was on his way over to entertain us when his plane went down in the Atlantic, or in the Channel, really, the English Channel.
What did you do when you were on leave?
We got, I don't remember how many months it was into our program or how many flights in. We got what's called R&R, relaxation, rest and relaxation. My mechanic and myself went to Scotland, to Edinburgh, Scotland, and had 4 days there. Stayed in a nice hotel, drank their whiskey, ate their food, and had a good time. And then you came back, and it was kind of like a relief valve. It was a relief valve, really.
It relieved a lot of stress.
Pardon me?
It relieved a lot of stress.
Oh yes, it did, yeah. Because we were shot down one time, and here's the story there. You're welcome to keep that if you want it.
Oh, thank you.
It was about our 22nd or 23rd mission. I'll just give you a synopsis. About our 22nd or 23rd mission, we were shot up badly. We were coming back from Germany to England, and we're running out of gas, and the pilot said we're not going to make it all the way back. And so he's coming back, and about 2,000 feet or 1,500 feet. And just north of Paris is a city called Reims. And there was an airstrip that the Germans had built for their fighters. And he looked down, our pilot looked down, he saw that, he said, I'll give you an option. You can either bail out or you can ride it in and we'll crash land. Well, I don't know why, whether we're all too chicken or what it was, but we all said, no, we'll ride it in with you. And so he said, okay, dump everything. So we dumped everything that was movable out of the airplane. oxygen tanks, machine guns, all my radio equipment, anything we could throw out, we did throw out. Because when you crash, it's like a car crash nowadays. When you crash, everything comes back at you. And so he came in. He didn't have enough fuel to play around, so he made one turn around this strip, and then started down, came down. And we went about 600-700 feet down the runway, and we hit a bomb. The Germans had pot-marked this whole runway with bombs all the way down. Now we were lucky the bomb did not go off, but it tore off the wheels on the left side, and we went a little farther and it tore off the wheel on the right side, and we flat spun all the way down. We got down to the end of the runway, luckily. We all opened the exits, doors, and windows and jumped out. We just about got out when the plane burst into flames. Now this was one day after this city was liberated by the Americans. Reims was liberated, and we were north of Reims a little way. And all of a sudden, out of nowhere came these civilian people, and they all had rifles. They pointed the rifles at us, and they were called FFI, French Forces of the Interior, all civilians. And they said, none of them spoke English. You know, all I could remember my high school French was nous avons américain, nous avons américain. And they accepted that momentarily. And we had our dog tags. And what saved us was the leader of this group, and there were about 20 of them. The leader of this group was a doctor, a French woman doctor. And she came up and questioned us individually and collectively. What's the capital of Michigan? Where do you say you're from? First she told us they were FFI. Then she said, what's the capital of Michigan? I told her, no. And then she went to the next guy who was from California. What's the capital of California? And went to the other guys individually and asked each one of them that was from a different state. What is the capital of your state? What's the biggest city? Well, I said Detroit. At that time it was the biggest city, you know. And then, and who is Bing Crosby? Or some easy questions like that, that the Germans would not know, supposedly would not know. After she was assured that we were Americans, she then took all 10 of us. She had a farm. She took us all back to her farmhouse, fed us a chicken dinner, bedded us down in her house. The next morning then she led us to a road and where the Corps of Engineers were the people that were making roads ahead of the infantry. And this Corps of Engineer crew would go down and make a road, and then they were coming back towards Paris. And she hailed a truck, or we all hailed a truck, and they took us back to Paris. Now in Paris they had 2 hotels. One for the American flyers that were shot down and the infantry, and the other was for the Canadian and the British that were shot down. They put us up in the hotels overnight. No, 2 nights we were there, but we had a 10 o'clock curfew. They allowed us to go into Paris and walk the streets of Paris, get wine and whatever else we could get, and then the next 2 days later they took us to an airfield called Le Bourget, where there were what are now big transport planes there, and they would fly us. They flew us back, all of us back to a base south of London that was especially for people that had been shot down. Now each one of these places would keep us overnight and check us out and so forth. Then from there they flew us back up to our base in Norwich. I think it was about our 22nd, 23rd mission, and then we had a day off or 2, and then we had to go back to flying. And after each mission that we flew, you'd come into a room like this, and they would have whiskey and scotch, and there would be 2 or 3 officers sitting here, and they would interrogate us. What did you see? Did the mission go well? Blah, blah, blah. And then you could have your whiskey and scotch if you wanted it. You didn't have to drink it, but then you'd go back to your barracks. And you would fly, we would fly, depending on the weather, we would fly 3 or 4 missions a week. If the weather was real bad, and it was in England many, many times, then you could have a couple days off. We'd get a pass and went to London. What else? Let's see. Yeah, that's about it. We'd go into London, have a good time in London, stay at the best hotels, because we the Americans always had more money than the British soldiers, and that was why in the beginning they didn't like us very much. You're oversexed, overpaid, and over here, is what they used to say. But later on they became very good friends, all of us. I had an excellent time and lived to tell about it.
Is there any particular humorous or unusual event that you can remember?
Yeah, there's several. One particular one was my girlfriend, who is now my wife, sent me a pair of pajamas, which was unheard of in the service. And just outside our base was a woman who did the laundry for us. If we didn't do our own, she would do the laundry for us. And so I took the pajamas in, and she did them, and 2 days later I picked it up, and I didn't even look at them or anything else. When I got them back to the barracks, or the base where we were, the apartments where we were living, I opened them up, and she had sewn ruffles on all of the legs, and I got ridiculed about that. Another time was on one of my trips into London. I went to a pawn shop and I bought a clarinet for a couple dollars or whatever it was, English pound or something. And I had never taken a lesson in my life. I bought this clarinet and I brought it back. And I went in our barracks and I was practicing the clarinet. And I learned how to play Silent Night, Holy Night. And so Christmas Eve, I opened the window and I stuck the clarinet out the window and I played Silent Night, Holy Night. And the next morning in the chow line, the guy says to me, the guy in front of me says to me, "I'd like to find that bastard that was playing that clarinet." I said, "So would I." Then I proceeded to lose the clarinet in a poker game.
Are there any pranks that you and your friends would pull?
Oh yeah, the usual Army pranks, whether it's flyers or infantry or anything else. When you had a barracks, you would short sheet somebody. That is, you take the end of the sheet and you fold it back about half or 3/4 of the way, so that when the person climbs in, they hit that stuff. I dated a nurse in London when I went in regularly. She was in a nursing school, and the only problem with her was, at the nursing schools in those days, they had a 10:30 curfew, and literally they locked the gates so you couldn't get in. So we would never be ready to go home by 10:30. So we'd take her back, myself and another guy would take her back to the fence, put her on our shoulders, and push her over the fence. She never got, as far as I know, she never got in any trouble.
What do you think, or what did you think of your officers and your fellow soldiers?
Fellow soldiers were fine. Our pilot happened to be a manager of a Sears store in Chicago, and when we first met him, he thought he was the little Jesus Christ on earth or something. And so what we did is we made a sign, and this sign said, "I am Jesus, little man, yes, by Jesus Christ I am." And we put it on the cockpit window in front of him, and he saw that, and then he was a changed man. He became very, very nice. And we all knew that each one of us depended on everybody on that plane for our life. And we got along real well. And the mechanic who lived in Ohio, was my personal friend throughout the whole thing. All of them were, but he was my personal friend.
Do you still keep in touch with him?
I have up until about 5 years ago. Then I sent him Christmas cards with notes and so forth, and I never did find out whether he died or not, but that ended our relations.
Did you keep a personal diary?
No, I did not. In fact, we were not allowed to take a personal diary with us if in the plane at all, because they did not want, if we were shot down, they didn't want the Germans to know that we were from Michigan or that the crew was from here or there. They didn't want them to know anything personal about us, really.
Do you remember how you felt the day that your service ended?
Yeah, very happy. After flying 35 missions, they offered me a direct commission if I would stay over in England and teach other radio operators the radio procedure. Because as I said earlier, the Englishmen had a special radio procedure. And they offered me a direct commission as a first lieutenant to stay over there, and I thought, no, that would be flying with another green crew, and I thought I'd stretch my luck enough. Also, while we were on these bombing missions, on the way back, if you ever lost your navigation or anything else, the English had a real unique system. They had what was called darky stations, and these were civilians who were farmers who had a barn with a radio up in the barn and radio signals and so forth. And if you came back and you didn't know where you were or anything else, you just called, "Hello, darky, darky. Hello, darky, darky. This is," and we all had code names when we were flying. You tell them who you were, and they would say, "Okay, you're 2 miles north of my station. Do a 180-degree turn." And the darky stations were about 5 miles apart, and they literally would steer us right back to our base. They saved many, many lives, I'm sure.
What did you do in the days and the weeks after your service had ended?
I came back from overseas. I ended up coming back to the United States, and I went to Clovis, New Mexico to teach and instruct on B-29s. Well, I should back up. I got married when we first came back. I had 10 days off. I got married, and then I went to Clovis, and later on, a week later, my wife came to join me, but I was stationed in Clovis for several months in 1945, I think it was, whenever. Yeah. And in the summer of 45, and then I was sent back to the U.S. to train crews on B-29s. We were stationed at Clovis, New Mexico, and because I was married, I was allowed to live off the base. And there's several reasons. At that time, Clovis was a small town of maybe 2,500 people. And on the base, we had 5,000. So they would not let the whole base out at any time. And also, if you were married, you could go and live in town. And so I luckily went in town and found a couple that would rent to us. And the couple was unique in that the wife, who was 6'3", was a school teacher in Clovis, and the husband, who was 6'7", was a railroad engineer. Now, he had tried to enlist in the Navy, the Army, the Marine Corps as a flyer, but he was too big for any of the planes. He couldn't fit in the cockpits of any of the planes. So they allowed us to live with him. And while we were there, while I was training other crews, the war in Europe ended, and we celebrated very noisily and very joyously. We celebrated. And then it was shortly after that, the atomic bomb was being created and was created and was tested at a place called Los Alamos, which was near, maybe 10 or 15 miles from where we were in Clovis. And they tested it there, and we had no idea. None of it was so secretive. We had no idea what was going on. We did see, like 20 miles away or 25 miles away, we saw a cloud in the sky, but had no idea what it was. And it wasn't until we heard about it on the radio, that they had bombed Japan, Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And then, all the while we were in flying, you received so many points for being overseas, you received so many points for the missions, and you received points for this and that. And at that time you had to have, I don't know how many points, but you had to have so many points to get out of service early. All of the servicemen were released eventually, but to get out early you had to have so many points, and I happened to have had enough points. And I was released from Clovis, went back to St. Louis, and I was discharged from there. And after I got out of service, back in civilian life, I thought, well, I'd missed all this growing up. I went in when I was 18, came back when I was 21. I missed all this growing up, and even though I was married, I thought you had to play poker every Friday night, you had to bowl, and you had to golf. And that's what I wanted to do. And my wife had a couple tough years getting used to that, or me getting used to it. And then she became pregnant while we were in Clovis. So when we got back, our child was born in February of 1946 in Detroit. She came back very much pregnant and delivered in Detroit. Then I went to, before I went in service, I went to night school at UD. I went a year and a half in night school, came back, and I wasn't smart enough to go use the GI Bill. I was too busy playing poker and bowling and golfing. And so I missed the GI Bill by 1 month. You had to take the GI Bill within X number of months, 3 months or 4 months, whatever it was, of getting out of service. And I didn't do that, so I had to pay. I got out of service and had no prospect of a job or anything, but a friend of mine from high school, his dad owned a paper company, and this is butcher paper, wrapping paper that was used in stores and butcher shops, and he offered me a job as a salesperson, so I went to work for him. Then I put in bids, job resumes and bids at 2 places, at the Grosse Pointe Park Police Department and at Detroit Edison. And I was interviewed by the chief of police in Grosse Pointe Park and interviewed by the employment people in Edison. And I was having mixed emotions about which ones I would take if and when they called me back. And it turned out Edison offered me $50 a week more than the police department, and I took the Edison job. And then when I went to work for Edison, I finally got some brains, went back to night school, and went to a place called Detroit Institute of Technology, which later joined with Lawrence Institute of Technology, and I got my degree in about 8 years at night school. You could not get it at UD. In those days, you couldn't get an engineering degree at night school. You had to switch over. After about 2 years of night school, you had to switch to day school. Well, I was married and needed some income, and so I went to night school, which was right downtown Detroit. Very convenient. And also the company, the Edison company, paid about 80% of my tuition, as long as I promised to stay with them. So I got an electrical engineering degree, from DIT, it was called Detroit Institute of Technology. Went to work for Edison in the power plants, pretty much doing testing and stuff like that. I did not physically work on any of the equipment in a power plant, but did testing and using the equipment there. Worked in the power plants for at least 6, 7, 8 years, something like that. Learning all about the power plants, because as any honest person will tell you, when you go to college, you get the book learning, but that's the end of it. I learned more in 1 year working with people in the plant, just actually what they did and what electrical engineering was all about. Then I worked with Edison for 40 years. But in the course of that 40 years, about the last 15, 20 years, I was called back into the general office and given several different jobs in the Edison relating to engineering. The best year I ever had was I was assigned as an interviewer we had a program where the employment people would go out to 12 different colleges, and they would look for people that were people that were graduate engineers or engineering technicians that were rather interested in working for a utility company. And then what employment would do would be take all of these people that they had interviewed, and they would look at their resumes and they would say, yeah, this man or woman, and there weren't many women in those days in engineering, this guy looks like he might have prospects for working for us. Employment would fly the boy into the airport. We would pick him up at the airport, take him downtown Detroit to the Pontchartrain Hotel, and all the while we were talking to the young lad, we'd tell him how great it was to be working for Edison. We'd put him up at the Pontchartrain, and I would have dinner with him that night, once more giving him a sales pitch. The next morning we would go down and take him to breakfast, and the night before they would be on their own. They could go all over downtown Detroit that they wanted. Next morning we'd pick them up, have breakfast with them, pick them up, give them another sales pitch, and then take them to one of the power plants and show them a power plant so that they would have some idea what they were getting into. Now, at that time, we had a room on the 7th floor of the Pontchartrain Hotel, which was strictly an interviewing room. It had a day bed in the room and chairs and tables like this. And I had a film clip that I would show them of how great it was, things like that. And that was the best year I ever had, because I had meals at the Pontchartrain Hotel had 3 restaurants, and I had an open charge at all of them. And the first couple times I did the interviewing by myself, and then my wife said, you know, I think some of these boys are just getting out of school would feel more at ease if there was a woman there. I said, fine, you know. So she came down, and she didn't do any interviewing, but she did go to dinner with us in the morning, at night, and breakfast in the morning and stuff like that. And it did literally put some of them at ease. Then I would take the person that I had, and I had a form I had to fill out, and I would say, hey, sounds like a good prospect, and send that back to employment. Employment at that time were the people that actually said, this is how much we can pay you. And I found out early in the game that college grads at that time knew the whole system. They would come and interview with Edison, with Ford, and with General Motors. And then they would go back and they would compare what this company would offer you, what that company would offer you, and what this company benefits in dollars and cents. and I think we would get maybe 1 out of 5 would come with that. As the rest, I have no idea where they went, but the rest were not with us.
Is what you did in the military, did that ever help you at all with your job?
No, not really, except it taught me discipline, which was important, is important. But that was about all. I did not use my radio experience at all as far as taking apart and putting together. I should back up. When I got out of service in Detroit, I went down to WJR and said, I've been a radio operator in service. Could you use me as a technician or something like that, or a radio operator? And they said, well, you can, if you go back and get your federal license as a radio operator, we could use you. But I really didn't have any interest in that. I was more interested once more in bowling and golfing and playing cards. I missed that opportunity. Went to the Golden Tower of the Fisher Building on the boulevard. So no, pretty much there was little or no, other than the discipline, there was little or nothing that I had in service that I could use. Nobody wanted a machine gun taken apart or anything else in those days.
Did your military experience ever influence the way you thought about the war or the military in general?
Yeah, I was very supportive of, and I still am very supportive of the military in any aspect. And this is off the record, but I was not in support of Bush sending troops over to Iraq. But I did and will support all of the services that are over there.
How did being in the service affect your life overall?
Overall, it was, I felt blessed and very lucky that I lived through it all. And it really firmed up my marriage because my wife had lived with me in Clovis, New Mexico, and so we were together from the start.
Is there anything you would like to add that we didn't cover?
I can't think of much of anything other than the fact that it was a good experience because I was in the Air Corps and because I was on a bomber crew. We kind of got special treatment. Whether that's fair or not is questionable, but we did get special treatment. And as I said earlier, I often thought later on that the reason they fed us so good was because it could have been our last meal. The Air Force did lose 57,000 men.
I think that's it.
What about those glasses?
Yeah, can we see?
Show us
Oh.
those glasses.
The sunglasses?
Yeah, this is not the case they came in, but this is what we were issued. Really, they were first rate. They were Ray-Bans, and then the 45 that we were issued with the holster, I had to turn in before I left England. I had to turn that back in. I don't know whether I would have liked it around the house or not, but I had to turn it in.
Did you wear those when you were flying?
Mm-hmm. Yes. Because when we got to 10,000 feet, we had to go on oxygen, but the oxygen mask was about like this, and so we would keep those on. And we flew all day missions, all daytime missions. The RAF, the Royal Air Force, flew all nighttime missions. So many, many times they would be coming back from a nighttime mission when we would be going over to our mission. And they essentially flew the same kind of missions that we did, bombing missions. And we bombed primarily all military targets or anything that was connected to the military, like a ball bearing plant that would be supplying ball bearings for the German fighter planes. We bombed up in the north part of Germany was the submarine base. We bombed that. And we bombed, and also we bombed our own troops too. Early in the war, when we were flying low level ground support, the ground people got too far ahead of. We were given the time we would take off. They would say, drop your anti-personnel bombs at such and such a mark, longitude, latitude, and so we would have. That was our instruction. We had to follow the instructions. But what our people back in England didn't realize or didn't know was that the ground troops had advanced more rapidly. And another interesting part of it was in the middle of our bombing missions, we were taken off bombing because General Patton had advanced too rapidly. The supply lines couldn't keep up with him. So he had advanced too rapidly, and he was stuck out in somewhere in France or Germany without gasoline. So they took us off bombing missions and put, I think there were 5-gallon gas cans, as many as they could get in every bomber. Put them in, and for 4 days we flew full of gasoline up to where Patton's forces were. We would fly, depending on how fast they loaded and unloaded us, we would fly one mission for sure every day, sometimes 2 missions a day. Go over, drop the gas cans off, turn around and go back to our base, get loaded up with more gas cans, go over. And what I didn't think of until much, much later in my life was that we were, you know, if anybody would have put a anti-aircraft on us or shot at us, we were a flying bomb ourselves with all that gasoline. But it worked out fine. If we flew 2 missions and got into where Patton's forces were at night, we would then stay overnight, and we'd either sleep in the airplane or out on the ground or wherever we could, really.
You said that you went on all-day missions. How did you get by, with being tired and hungry?
Well, we would take off at daylight, which was 6 o'clock, something like that. We'd form up and we'd fly over, and our missions would be anywhere from 3 or 4 hours. The longest one is about 7 hours, and that was when we went to Berlin. That was considered a long mission. That was the longest mission. And so we'd come back and we'd have a normal evening. We'd come back and have a good meal and play cards, do whatever we wanted to.
Did you join any veterans organizations?
Yeah, I did. I joined, trying to think what it was called. It's not in existence anymore, but it was an American AMVETS, American Vets of European Theater. AVET, American Vets of European Theater. And the branch that I was in happened to be made up of all Edison men, and it folded after about 2 or 3 years. So I never did join the VFW or the American Legion. Why, I don't know. I just never did.
Do you ever go to reunions?
I went to one about 5 years ago in Toledo. There's a field called Wright-Patterson Airfield, and our particular group, our 8th Air Force 754 Squadron, had a reunion at Wright-Patterson. My wife and I and my grandson and a neighbor of his went down there and stayed at a hotel, and then went to the reunion, 3-day reunion, and then came back. But generally, they have what I would call a local one very seldom. Like if there was one in someplace in Illinois, I'd go to that, but I don't know why, but there are several in California, several in New York State, several in the south. I never went to the one that worked out fine was the one in Toledo. That worked out real good. And of course I met fellow crew members there. And that was probably a good 10 years ago.
How did it feel to see people, I mean, that had been in the service as well?
It was great, really, seeing them, talking to them. You know, you tell them, you know, there were a lot of baloney stories, but most of it was just real nice, real good. Very, very good meeting, seeing that they were all alive and well, and how many kids do you have, how many grandchildren do you have, stuff like that. Very rewarding, really.
I think that's it.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome, and you're welcome to that. You can read it and toss it, do whatever you want with it, right?
Did you want to keep this?
No, that's a picture of a picture.